What would you do if your husband threw you out in a freezing storm on the exact night your father died? Clara thought her life was over as she watched him drive away with his mistress. She was left in the mud with nothing but a cheap wooden box. But her ruthless husband made one fatal mistake. He had absolutely no idea that opening that tiny box would instantly make Clara the most powerful woman on earth. Make sure to watch until the very end to see exactly how this incredible story unfolds. If you are hooked, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Also, take a quick second to let me know in the comments where you are watching from. I absolutely love seeing where in the world my amazing viewers are located. Let's get right back into the story. The rain hit the windshield like a fist, heavy and unrelenting against the glass of the speeding luxury sedan. Inside the car, the silence was suffocating, broken only by the aggressive swish of the wipers and the tight, furious breaths of the man behind the wheel. Clara sat in the back seat, her body trembling uncontrollably as the chill from the air conditioning washed over her damp clothes. Her hands, pale and shaking, were wrapped tightly around a small, intricately carved wooden clockwork box. The wood was worn smooth from years of gentle touch, smelling faintly of sawdust and old brass. It was all she had left. Less than an hour ago, Clara had stood in a dimly lit, bleach-scented room in a run-down public hospital, watching her father take his very last breath. He was a humble watchmaker, a man who had lived his entire life with grease on his fingers and unconditional kindness in his eyes. He had slipped away quietly, leaving Clara with an agonizing void in her chest and this small wooden puzzle box, which he had pressed into her palms just before the monitors flatlined. She was drowning in a grief so profound it felt physically impossible to draw an air. But her husband, Marcus, was not mourning. His knuckles were white as he gripped the leather steering wheel, his jaw clenched in absolute rage. He wasn't upset about the tragic passing of his father-in-law. He was furiously calculating the cost of a missed networking dinner. He muttered curses under his breath, bitterly complaining that this pathetic, drawn-out hospital trip was destroying his chances to mingle with the senior partners at his firm. He didn't offer Clara a single word of comfort. He didn't even bother to look at her in the rear-view mirror. Suddenly, the sharp chime of Marcus's phone shattered the heavy tension in the cabin. He glanced at the dashboard screen, and his entire demeanor shifted instantly. The hostile anger in his eyes evaporated, replaced by a sudden, desperate concern. Clara recognized the name flashing on the digital display. It was Chloe. When Marcus answered, the voice pouring to the car speakers was high-pitched, breathless, and artificial. Chloe claimed she was stranded on the other side of town with a flat tire, terrified in the rain, needing him to come rescue her immediately. She didn't actually sound terrified. She sounded like a woman who knew exactly how much power she held over someone else's husband. Marcus didn't hesitate for a single second. He slammed his foot on the brake, sending the heavy car swerving violently toward the shoulder of the desolate highway. The tires tore through the wet gravel and shuddered to a harsh stop in a thick rut of deep mud. Clara jolted forward, clutching her father's box to her chest, her heart pounding wildly. Marcus turned around, his eyes cold, empty, and completely devoid of humanity. He looked at his grieving wife and told her to get out. He stated, without a tremor of remorse, that he needed the car for a real emergency, and she was slowing him down. Clara froze, unable to comprehend the sheer, staggering cruelty of his words. Outside, the storm was howling across a pitch-black stretch of empty road miles from civilization. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg, to remind him that she had just watched her father die. But before she could form the words, her mother-in-law, Evelyn, turned around from the passenger seat. Evelyn's lips curled into a wicked, highly satisfied sneer. Without a single word of hesitation, the older woman reached into the back, grabbed Clara's thin, threadbare winter coat off the seat, and shoved her own door open. Evelyn threw the jacket straight into a murky puddle of freezing mud. She coldly informed Clara that she was useless baggage, just like her penniless father, and ordered her out of the vehicle. Numb with shock and spiritually broken, Clara stepped out into the freezing downpour. The heavy car doors slammed shut in perfect unison. The engine roared to life, and the tires spun out maliciously, spraying Clara with a thick wave of icy sludge as the sedan sped off into the pitch-black night. She stood completely alone in the raging storm, abandoned by the very people who were supposed to protect her, holding nothing in the dark but her father's wooden box. The icy rain lashed against Clara's skin like scattered glass as she began the grueling miles-long walk down the pitch-black highway. Every step forward in the freezing mud was agonizing, but the physical cold could not rival the sheer, paralyzing ice in her chest. To keep herself moving, to keep her heart from simply stopping in the dark, she pressed the wooden clockwork box tight against her collarbone and closed her eyes for just a fraction of a second, letting her mind escape into the past. She retreated to the only place she had ever truly felt safe. She went back to a dusty, cluttered little clock repair shop, bathed in warm, amber afternoon light. It was a chaotic sanctuary filled with the endless, comforting symphony of 1,000 ticking metronomes, grandfather clocks, and delicate pocket watches. That shop was her entire world, and at the center of it was her father, Arthur. To the rest of the town, Arthur was just a struggling, eccentric tinkerer. He was a man who drove a spectacularly rusted sedan that coughed thick smoke, and he wore the exact same frayed, elbow-patched tweed jacket every single day of his life. But to Clara, he was a giant. He was a man who possessed nothing of material value, yet spoke with the profound, unshakable wisdom of a king. Clara remembered sitting on a wobbly wooden stool by his workbench, watching his callous, grease-stained fingers meticulously repair timepieces that others had thrown away as garbage. Arthur never rushed. He taught Clara that true integrity lived in the details no one else would ever see. He would hold up the tiniest, most insignificant-looking brass gear with a pair of tweezers and explain how the smallest, hidden pieces always bore the heaviest burdens. He told her that without the quiet strength of the unseen gears, the entire machine would eventually tear itself apart. He taught her the absolute value of patience, urging her to understand that people, much like broken clocks, take time to reveal their true mechanics. What Clara did not know, and what the cruel world around her could never have guessed, was that Arthur's entire existence was a carefully constructed, masterful illusion. He was not a poverty-stricken watchmaker barely scraping by on copper coins. He was a man harboring an empire. Arthur had actively, intentionally buried a staggering fortune, choosing a life of humble obscurity for one fiercely guarded reason. He wanted to protect his daughter from the venomous corruption of wealth. He had seen firsthand how money rotted the human soul, how it twisted love into transaction, and how it attracted beautiful, empty parasites. He wanted Clara to grow up grounded. He desperately wanted her to experience a life where she was valued solely for the purity of her spirit, hoping she would one day find a partner who loved her for her heart and not for the bottomless depth of a bank account. That desperate protective love culminated on a quiet, rainy afternoon years ago, a day that now echoed perfectly in Clara's devastated mind. She remembered Arthur pulling the intricately carved wooden puzzle box from beneath his workbench. He had placed it gently into her teenage hands, his warm, rough palms wrapping over hers. He had looked deeply into her eyes with a solemn, heavy sorrow, as if he knew exactly what the future held. He strictly forbade her from forcing the intricate gears open. He told her to carry it with her, to let it be a silent guardian, and to wait. He promised her that one day the universe would force a brutal truth upon her. "Do not open this, my beautiful girl," he had whispered, his voice thick with emotion, until the very moment the world finally takes its mask off. Now, dragging her numb, freezing feet through the flooded shoulder of the highway, shivering violently as the storm raged on, Clara gripped the intricate with tighter. The mask hadn't just slipped tonight. It had been violently ripped away, revealing the terrifying, ugly monsters she had invited into her own home. The pale, sickly light of dawn was just beginning to bleed across the horizon when Clara finally dragged herself up the sprawling driveway of her own home. She was drenched to the bone, her muscles screaming in agony, her shoes ruined and heavy with thick highway mud. She pushed the heavy oak front door open, stepping into a house that felt less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully decorated, freezing tomb. Standing shivering in the grand foyer, surrounded by imported Italian marble and cold modern art, Clara looked at her reflection in a massive gilded mirror. She didn't recognize a hollow, shattered woman staring back at her, her mind violently unspooled, dragging her back to the very beginning, forcing her to confront the agonizing question of how her life had devolved into this absolute nightmare. It had all started with a devastatingly simple mistake. She had met Marcus when he was nothing but a struggling, exhausted junior analyst surviving on stale coffee and sheer desperation. Back then, he had a fierce fire in his eyes. Clara had foolishly mistaken that burning, relentless hunger for passion. She believed he genuinely wanted to build a meaningful, honest life together. But as the years bled on, and Marcus began clawing his way up the jagged corporate ladder at cutthroat, predatory investment firm known as Vanguard Capital, she realized that fire wasn't passion at all. It was a vicious, unyielding greed. The firm was a ruthless shark tank, and to survive it, Marcus eagerly shed every ounce of his humanity. The higher he climbed, the more his soul seemed to rot from the inside out. He became utterly consumed by a shallow, desperate obsession with elite status, aggressively chasing luxury sports cars, heavily branded designer suits, and the suffocating approval of wealthy executives he secretly despised. He stopped seeing Clara as a loving partner and started viewing her as a social liability, a painfully ordinary anchor dragging down his carefully curated, high society aesthetic. The final, fatal blow to their marriage arrived in the form of his mother, Evelyn. When she invited herself to move into the sprawling guest wing under the guise of a temporary financial hardship, the house instantly transformed into a psychological war zone. Evelyn was a venomous, master manipulator masked by forced elegance and expensive perfume. Almost overnight, she relegated Clara to the role of an unpaid, entirely unappreciated servant in her own home. Evelyn made it her daily mission to remind Clara of her absolute inferiority, loudly criticizing the way Clara cooked, the way she dressed, and the quiet way she carried herself. She relentlessly belittled Clara's humble roots, taking a vicious, theatrical delight in mocking the dusty little clock repair shop. During lavish dinner parties, Evelyn would sip expensive wine and openly refer to Clara's beloved father as pathetic, penniless tinkerer, a man who wasted a pathetic life playing with cheap toys while real men built actual wealth. Instead of fighting back, Clara absorbed the psychological beatings. She endured the endless parade of insults in absolute silence. She leaned desperately on her father's teachings, treating her fractured marriage like one of Arthur's broken timepieces. She applied the quiet, steady patience of a master watchmaker, enduring the agonizing friction, hoping beyond hope that the kind, driven boy she had fallen in love with was still trapped somewhere inside the cold, calculating monster Marcus had become. She had convinced herself that if she just endured the storm, the gears would eventually align, and her husband would finally see her worth. But as she stood dripping wet in the freezing foyer, clutching the small wooden box, Clara finally accepted the brutal reality that some machines are simply too broken to ever be fixed. Clara dragged her heavy, mud-caked boots toward the kitchen, drawn by the stark, mocking sounds of cheerful morning chatter and the smell of sizzling butter. When she rounded the corner, the breath was violently knocked from her lungs. Sitting casually at the gleaming marble center island, bathed in the soft morning sunlight, was Chloe. The mistress. Chloe was the absolute embodiment of manufactured, high-end perfection, a vain, materialistic socialite whose entire existence revolved around a heavily curated, heavily filtered aesthetic. But it wasn't just her sudden presence that sent a shockwave of nausea through Clara's exhausted body. Chloe was lounging comfortably in Clara's own deep burgundy silk robe, her impeccably manicured fingers wrapped delicately around Clara's favorite ceramic mug. She looked perfectly at home, sipping imported coffee, while Clara stood dripping freezing rain onto the polished hardwood floor. Marcus was leaning casually against a bespoke espresso machine, dressed in a crisp designer dress shirt, scrolling through his phone without a single trace of guilt on his handsome face. When Clara demanded to know what was happening, her voice cracking under the devastating weight of her grief and exhaustion, Marcus didn't even flinch. He simply rolled his eyes, letting out a loud, exasperated sigh, and immediately began to gaslight her with a practiced, terrifying ease. He commanded Clara to stop acting so hysterical, smoothly claiming that Chloe was a highly sought-after branding consultant. He insisted that she was an essential corporate asset who had come over early to help him strategize for an impending, massive promotion at Vanguard Capital. It was a blatant, incredibly insulting lie, a pathetic illusion designed to further humiliate Clara in her own kitchen. Adding to the sheer psychological torture, Evelyn was standing at the oversized stove, humming a cheerful little tune as she expertly flipped a delicate crepe. Evelyn served the gourmet breakfast directly to Chloe with a warm, maternal smile, completely ignoring the shivering, grief-stricken woman bleeding muddy water just a few feet away. Evelyn acted as though Clara were completely invisible, an unwelcome ghost haunting a beautiful life that no longer belonged to her. The absolute audacity of the scene finally snapped the last fraying thread of Clara's patience. Her profound sadness suddenly hardened into a sharp, crystalline anger. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but fiercely direct, and confronted Marcus. She demanded to know how he could possibly live with himself, how he could abandon his own wife in a freezing storm on a pitch-black highway on the very night she watched her beloved father take his final breath. The kitchen fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Marcus slowly set his phone down on the cold granite counter. He stepped closer to Clara, towering over her, his eyes entirely devoid of any warmth or basic humanity. He leaned in and coldly told her that her father was a pathetic nobody who had lived a worthless life and died with absolutely nothing to his name. He sneered, stating that Clara brought zero financial or social value to their marriage, and viciously informed her that she should be on her hands and knees thanking him for generously allowing her to continue living under the roof of his magnificent house. Before Clara could even process the sheer venom of his words, a sharp, patronizing laugh sliced through the heavy tension. Chloe was smirking over the rim of Clara's favorite mug. Her cold, calculating eyes trailed down to Clara's trembling hands, locking onto the intricately carved wooden clockwork box. Chloe pointed a perfectly polished finger at Arthur's final gift and openly giggled, dismissing the priceless heirloom as a pathetic piece of cheap, embarrassing garbage. She casually told Clara to throw it in the trash where it belonged, right alongside the rest of her father's worthless memory. Clara didn't scream, and she didn't cry. She just held the box tighter against her chest, feeling the hidden gears pressing against her skin, knowing with absolute certainty that the mask her husband wore had finally, permanently shattered. The cemetery was a desolate stretch of uneven, gray earth beneath a sky that looked like bruised iron. The wind whipped violently through the barren branches of a solitary oak tree, chilling Clara to the very marrow of her bones. She stood completely alone beside a painfully simple, bare-bones pine casket. It was the cheapest box a funeral home offered, a stark, humiliating reality forced upon her because Marcus had outright refused to contribute a single dime to the burial costs. He had coldly stated that dead men do not need velvet linings, leaving Clara to scrape together the absolute minimum just to get her father's body into ground respectfully. The bleak silence of the graveyard was suddenly shattered by the aggressive crunch of tires on wet gravel. Marcus had finally arrived, 20 minutes late to his own father-in-law's funeral. He did not walk toward the grave with the solemn respect the heartbreaking moment demanded. Instead, he strutted across the damp grass with Chloe clinging tightly to his arm. They were a grotesque display of forced opulence, draped head to toe in flashy, heavily branded designer clothing that practically screamed for attention in the quiet graveyard. Chloe teetered on ridiculously high stiletto heels, wearing oversized sunglasses that hid her apathetic eyes, looking as though she were attending a high society fashion week rather than a burial. Trailing closely behind them was Evelyn, who immediately shattered the solemnity of the devastating moment by loudly and audibly complaining that the cemetery mud was permanently ruining the Italian leather of her expensive imported shoes. They did not offer Clara a hug. They did not bow their heads in prayer. They stood several feet away, radiating a toxic, impatient energy. The lone, underpaid groundskeeper cleared his throat and stepped forward to begin lowering the casket into the cold earth. Before the first creak of the winch could even echo through the graveyard, Marcus aggressively pulled back his tailored sleeve and checked his heavy, solid gold watch. He let out an exaggerated sigh, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, and loudly announced that they needed to leave immediately. He proudly proclaimed that they had secured exclusive VIP invitations to a massive, elite corporate gala hosted by Ethelgard Holdings. It was a mysterious, impossibly wealthy global conglomerate that Vanguard Capital had been desperately trying to secure a partnership with for years, and Marcus considered this extravagant gala his ultimate golden ticket to unimaginable wealth and supreme status. He looked directly into Clara's hollow, tear-stained eyes and told her that he simply could not afford to waste another second standing around in the dirt for a dead man who amounted to absolutely nothing. Without another word, Marcus turned his back on his grieving wife. Chloe let out a soft, mocking scoff, linking her arm back through his, while Evelyn practically sprinted back toward the warmth of the luxury sedan. Clara stood paralyzed, the biting wind whipping her hair across her face, watching the taillights of her husband's car disappear down the winding cemetery road. The deafening silence of the graveyard crashed down on her trembling shoulders. As she looked down at the cheap pine box holding the only person who had ever truly loved her, Clara finally hit absolute rock bottom. The heavy, suffocating veil of denial was completely ripped away from her eyes. She realized with a terrifying, heart-stopping clarity that her entire marriage had been a vile, meticulously crafted lie, and her years of quiet, obedient silence had been her most catastrophic mistake. Clara collapsed onto the freezing, mud-soaked earth, her knees sinking into the dirt beside her father's cheap pine casket. The tears she'd been violently holding back for days finally broke free, pouring down her cold cheeks in heavy, uncontrollable sobs. She clutched the wooden clockwork box tightly against her chest, feeling utterly broken and entirely alone in a world that had seemingly chewed her up and spit her out. But as her heartbreaking cries echoed through the desolate graveyard, the low, powerful hum of heavy engines began to vibrate beneath the damp soil. Clara slowly lifted her tear-streaked face. Gliding silently through the wrought iron gates of the cemetery was a staggering fleet of jet-black, heavily armored Rolls-Royces. They moved with a predatory grace, their dark, tinted windows reflecting the bleak iron sky. The motorcade came to a precise, synchronized halt directly behind her. The doors of the lead vehicle opened, and a distinguished, silver-haired gentleman stepped out into the biting wind. He wore an impeccably tailored bespoke suit that radiated quiet, unimaginable wealth, and he carried a large black umbrella, which he gently raised to shield Clara from the freezing rain. The man looked down at her with profound, deeply sorrowful kindness in his striking gray eyes. He reached out a gloved hand and introduced himself as Mr. Sterling, speaking in a calm, highly refined voice that seemed to command the very air around them. He explained that he was Arthur's personal wealth manager, a confidant who had been watching closely from the shadows for over 2 decades. Clara stared at him, her mind completely unable to process what was happening. Sterling knelt beside her in the mud, completely ignoring the damage to his expensive trousers. He softly told Clara that the time for waiting had finally come to an end, gently instructing her to look down at the intricately carved wooden box in her trembling hands. "The mask has fallen, Clara," he whispered, quoting the exact words her father had spoken all those years ago. Guided by a sudden electric clarity, Clara wiped her eyes and looked closely at the puzzle box. She remembered the dusty repair shop. She remembered Arthur's gentle voice teaching her about the patience of hidden gears and the perfect, necessary alignment of time. Her freezing fingers moved instinctively over the wood, pressing and twisting the complex carvings, applying the exact rhythm her father had ingrained into her soul. With a sharp, incredibly satisfying mechanical click, the top of the wooden box sprang open. Resting softly on a bed of faded red velvet was a heavy, solid gold signet ring engraved with a magnificent crest, accompanied by a small, neatly folded handwritten letter. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the glowing gold. Mr. Sterling slowly stood up, looking down at the cheap pine casket with a gaze of absolute, unwavering reverence. He delivered the mind-blowing truth that would instantly rewrite the very fabric of Clara's existence. Arthur was not a poor, struggling watchmaker. He was the brilliant, visionary shadow founder and sole trillionaire owner of Ethelgar Holdings. He was the unseen emperor of the exact same mysterious, ultra-wealthy global conglomerate that Marcus was currently begging to partner with. Sterling explained with a cool, dangerous edge to his voice that Ethelgard owned every single luxury brand, real estate firm, and corporate bank that Marcus and Chloe worshipped. Her father had built the largest private fortune on the face of the earth, and he had done it all in absolute silence. Mr. Sterling bowed his head deeply, the rain pouring off the edge of his umbrella, and officially addressed Clara not as a grieving, abandoned wife, but as the sole, undisputed heir to the Ethelgard Empire. The armored Rolls-Royce glided silently away from the graveyard, carrying Clara away from a lifetime of quiet obedience and straight into the heart of unimaginable power. They drove through the sprawling city until they reached the breathtaking, fortress-like global headquarters of Ethelgard Holdings. It was a staggering monolithic structure of black glass and reinforced steel that pierced the sky, a silent, awe-inspiring testament to the empire her father had built completely from shadows. Inside the cavernous, hyper-secure penthouse office, Mr. Sterling left Clara alone at a massive mahogany desk with a handwritten letter she had pulled from the wooden box. The heavy parchment was covered in Arthur's familiar, meticulous handwriting. In it, her father explained that he had never wanted to burden her with the crushing, isolating weight of infinite money until she truly understood the darkest depths of human nature. He wrote that wealth in the wrong hands is a venomous poison, but in the hands of someone who has known profound suffering and betrayal, it is a magnificent tool to violently balance the scales of justice. He promised her that her heart was pure, and she was finally ready to wield that tool. As she absorbed the immense weight of his final words, a cold, unbreakable resolve settled permanently over her fractured spirit. The grieving, timid wife who had begged for her husband's meager scraps of affection simply ceased to exist. In her place, a terrifyingly calm Titan awoke. A discreet team of elite stylists, summoned by Sterling, guided Clara through a powerful, silent physical transformation. She shed the damp, threadbare thrift store dress that Marcus and Evelyn had always mocked. She was meticulously draped in quiet, unassailable luxury, wearing a bespoke, perfectly tailored charcoal silhouette that radiated absolute, crushing authority without needing to scream for attention. The final, most important touch was a small, heavy velvet box Sterling gently handed to her. Inside was Arthur's ultimate, crowning masterpiece, a priceless, one-of-a-kind mechanical watch he had spent decades building specifically for her. As she strapped the intricate, mesmerizing mesh of gold and sapphire glass to her wrist, she felt the steady ticking against her pulse. It was a physical reminder that her father was still with her, and that her time as a victim was permanently over. Miles away, in the grand, chandelier-lit ballroom of a five-star luxury hotel, Marcus was buzzing with intoxicating, arrogant electricity. The Vanguard Capital Gala was in full swing, a loud, flashy spectacle dripping with excess, and the deafening roar of corporate elites aggressively networking. Chloe clung tightly to his arm, sipping vintage champagne and flashing her perfect, empty smile at anyone wearing a heavy Rolex. But there was a massive, frantic energy violently rippling through ballroom tonight. Rumors had just officially confirmed that the legendary Ethelgard Holdings had executed a flawless, hostile takeover, buying Vanguard Capital outright in a single, devastatingly swift cash transaction. The whispers traveling through the room were feverish, because a mysterious, newly appointed CEO of Ethelgard was reportedly arriving tonight in person to ruthlessly restructure the firm's entire leadership. Blinded by his own towering, unchecked narcissism, Marcus was convinced that this was his moment of supreme triumph. He genuinely believed that his ruthless ambition had finally caught the eye of the trillion-dollar empire. He stood near the center of the room, loudly boasting to his stunned colleagues, utterly convinced that before the night was over, the anonymous CEO would personally shake his hand and publicly name him senior partner. He straightened his expensive silk tie, completely unaware that the very woman he had abandoned in the freezing mud was currently speeding toward the gala, bringing a storm of absolute ruin he could not possibly comprehend. The executive boardroom of Vanguard Capital was a sprawling temple of corporate greed, lined with floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a sweeping, intoxicating view of the glittering city skyline. The most elite, ruthless power players of the financial world had been ushered inside this lavish space, holding their collective breath for the arrival of the mysterious new trillionaire CEO who now owned their entire existence. Marcus stood front and center at the massive mahogany conference table, radiating a sickening, arrogant confidence. Chloe was clinging tightly to his arm, wearing a heavily branded dress that cost more than most people made in a year, while Evelyn stood just behind them, casually sipping vintage champagne and basking in the stolen glory of her son's impending coronation. Marcus was holding court, laughing much too loudly, aggressively bragging to a circle of nervous senior partners about his brilliant strategies and his inevitable ascension to the top of the newly acquired firm. He was flying higher than he had ever flown in his entire life, completely intoxicated by the fragile illusion of his own supreme dominance. And then, the heavy atmosphere in the room violently shifted. The low, buzzing hum of elite networking abruptly died, replaced by a suffocating, dead silence as the massive double doors at the end of the boardroom slowly swung open. A team of imposing, impeccably dressed private security guards stepped into the room in perfect unison, immediately parting the sea of wealthy executives. Walking directly behind them was Mr. Sterling, holding a black leather folio and looking completely unfazed by the staggering amount of corporate power gathered in the room. But it was a woman walking beside Sterling who sent a physical shockwave of absolute, paralyzing terror straight down Marcus's spine. It was Clara. The visual impact of her entrance was nothing short of cinematic. She did not look like the broken, weeping woman they had violently discarded in the mud on the side of a freezing highway. She moved with the fluid, apex predator grace of a born emperor, draped in breathtaking, understated luxury that made every flashy designer label in the room look like a cheap, desperate costume. The steady, rhythmic ticking of her father's priceless mechanical watch seemed to echo perfectly with her calm, unhurried footsteps. Marcus's smug, triumphant smile did not just fade. It violently melted off his face, instantly replaced by a sheer, suffocating horror. His brain completely short-circuited as he stared at the wife he thought he had destroyed. Standing right behind him, Evelyn let out a pathetic, strangled gasp. All the color drained from her aged face. Her trembling fingers went limp, and her delicate crystal champagne glass slipped from her hand, shattering violently against the polished marble floor. The sharp, violent crack of the breaking glass echoed like a gunshot in the perfectly silent room. Chloe turned a sickly, translucent shade of pale, her eyes widening in sheer panic as she instantly recognized a woman whose silk robe she had stolen, the woman she had openly mocked as garbage just that very morning. Clara did not yell. She did not sneer, and she did not gloat. She possessed a power so absolute and a calm so deeply terrifying that she did not need to raise her voice to command the space. The crowd of vicious, predatory executives practically scrambled over each other to clear a wide path for her. Clara walked the entire length of the sprawling mahogany table, the air growing colder with every step she took. She reached the oversized leather chair at the very head of the boardroom, the ultimate throne reserved only for the undisputed ruler of the empire. She gracefully sat down, gently folded her hands on the polished wood, and looked directly into the wide, terrified eyes of her husband. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, heavy, and suffocating, thick with the electric tension of a public execution about to take place. Clara sat perfectly still at the head of the sprawling mahogany table, her cold, unblinking gaze locked onto Marcus, who was visibly sweating, his breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. When Clara finally spoke, her voice was a masterclass in controlled, devastating precision. She did not raise her tone, but every single syllable struck the room like a velvet-wrapped hammer. She calmly informed Marcus that his employment at Vanguard Capital was officially terminated, effective immediately, citing gross moral bankruptcy and a catastrophic failure of basic human integrity. But she did not stop there. With a subtle nod to Mr. Sterling, Clara revealed that Ethelgard Holdings possessed enough unyielding leverage to permanently blacklist Marcus across every single tier of the global financial sector. She coldly promised him that he would never touch another portfolio, negotiate another deal, or step foot inside a corporate office for the rest of his natural life. His entire identity was instantly, permanently vaporized. Sensing the absolute annihilation of the man standing beside her, Chloe immediately attempted to preserve her own fragile existence. She physically recoiled from Marcus, stepping away and frantically stammering out a pathetic apology, attempting to portray herself as a clueless victim caught in the crossfire. Clara shifted her piercing gaze toward the mistress, a faint, razor-sharp smile playing on her lips. Clara revealed a secondary, mind-bending twist that completely shattered Chloe's heavily filtered reality. She calmly explained that Chloe's luxurious influencer lifestyle, her massive brand deals, and her exclusive sponsorships were all managed by a boutique marketing agency wholly owned by Ethelgard Holdings. With a single elegant tap of her manicured finger on the polished wood, Clara announced that she had already frozen all of Chloe's corporate accounts and permanently terminated every single one of her lucrative contracts. In less than 30 seconds, Chloe's entire curated high-end existence was utterly wiped off the map, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the stolen dress on her back and a mountain of crushing debt. Watching the house of cards violently collapse, Evelyn completely lost her mind. The venomous, arrogant matriarch crumbled into a weeping, pathetic mess. She stumbled forward on trembling legs, desperately clutching her chest, and frantically began begging for mercy. She shamelessly tried to play the family card, weeping hysterically and crying out that they were blood, that Arthur would have wanted forgiveness, and that she had always secretly loved Clara like a true daughter. Clara's eyes hardened into pure, glacial ice. She did not entertain the pathetic, theatrical performance for a single second. Instead, she smoothly slid a sleek black folder across the surface of the table until it stopped directly at Evelyn's trembling fingertips. It was a formal eviction notice. Clara revealed the final, crushing secret. Her father, the brilliant watchmaker, had quietly purchased a mortgage to Marcus's sprawling luxury mansion years ago. The very house where Evelyn had tortured Clara, the house where Marcus had confidently paraded his mistress, belonged entirely to the woman they had abandoned in the freezing mud. Clara leaned forward, the steady ticking of her father's masterpiece watch echoing in the dead silence, and delivered her final, devastating verdict. She gave them exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises, explicitly ordering them to leave with absolutely nothing but the clothes currently on their backs, banishing them into the very same cold, unforgiving darkness they had so gleefully forced upon her. 6 months later, the relentless, unforgiving pendulum of time had swung completely in the other direction, delivering a brand of absolute, poetic karma that no amount of frantic begging could ever undo. The freezing rain poured down on a desolate, deeply isolated industrial shipping yard on the absolute outskirts of the city. There, working a grueling, bone-chilling graveyard shift in the dead of night, was Marcus, stripped of his imported tailored suits and his towering, toxic arrogance. He looked easily 10 years older. His face was deeply lined with exhaustion. His hands, once soft and perfectly manicured for shaking hands with wealthy executives, were heavily blistered and bleeding as he dragged massive, grease-covered wooden pallets across the rough, unforgiving concrete. His spirit was entirely, permanently broken, utterly hollowed out by the crushing, inescapable weight of his new reality. He was completely and utterly alone. The very second his corporate accounts were frozen and his luxury mansion was abruptly repossessed, Chloe had vanished like thin smoke. She abandoned him without a single word of goodbye, only to find herself rapidly plummeting into her own suffocating abyss of insurmountable legal debt, her heavily filtered, fake aesthetic permanently erased from the world as she faded into total obscurity. Meanwhile, Evelyn was entirely trapped in a cramped, dingy roadside motel on the edge of the highway, forced to listen to the agonizing, endless buzz of a broken neon sign outside her painfully thin window. The very high society friends she had spent decades desperately trying to impress now treated her like a contagious disease, outright refusing to answer her frantic phone calls or acknowledge her miserable existence. Miles away, bathed in the warm, golden light of a beautiful spring afternoon, Clara was absolutely thriving. She sat peacefully at her father's antique wooden desk in the sweeping penthouse of Ethelgard Holdings, looking radiantly beautiful. The hollow, terrified woman who had once shrunk under the weight of her husband's daily cruelty was completely gone, beautifully replaced by a glowing, quietly powerful titan. But Clara was not using her staggering wealth to buy hollow status symbols or ruthlessly intimidate her corporate rivals. Instead, she was aggressively directing her father's massive empire toward profound, life-changing philanthropy. She spent her busy days happily approving intricate blueprints for state-of-the-art public hospitals and heavily funded schools in deeply underprivileged neighborhoods, ensuring that Arthur's magnificent legacy would echo beautifully through generations. She had taken the immense, world-shifting power of her grand inheritance and masterfully transformed it into a brilliant, unyielding force for absolute good. Later that serene afternoon, Clara walked slowly to the quiet, perfectly manicured grounds of a private, beautifully weeping willow-lined cemetery. She wore a simple, deeply elegant coat, the gentle breeze catching her hair as she approached a magnificent, towering monument of flawless polished white marble. It was her beloved father's resting place, transformed from a cheap plot of dirt into a beautiful sanctuary that commanded absolute respect and eternal peace. She stood quietly before the stone, feeling an overwhelming, profound sense of healing wash completely over her soul. Reaching delicately into her coat pocket, Clara pulled out a single, perfectly polished brass clock gear and a beautifully vibrant red rose. She placed them gently on the marble ledge. She looked up at the endless expanse of the clear blue sky and smiled a warm, genuine smile, finally understanding the true, breathtaking depth of her father's quiet wisdom. Arthur's ultimate gift to her was never the trillion-dollar empire, the fleets of armored cars, or the endless corporate power. His absolute greatest gift was the excruciating, heartbreaking journey that forced her to finally discover her own unbreakable strength, teaching her once and for all that true wealth is never defined by what you carry in your bank account, but by the absolute purity of the character you absolutely refuse to compromise. Some machines must be entirely broken, so they can be rebuilt to run forever. If this story resonated with your heart and reminded you of your own incredible worth, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this powerful message with someone who needs to hear it today.